Now that Carlotta has been out for a couple of days, I think we can start forming some final opinions on her, especially now that most people probably have her built up after exploring Renacita and getting all of her materials. At least, I know I managed to get my Carlotta built up in just one day, which I'm very impressed by. But how good is Carlotta actually? And what are some things you need to consider before you end up getting baited by all of these people hitting insane numbers? Well, that's what this video is. I'm gonna be asking myself, how good is Carlotta actually? First of all, because she's a main DPS, what we need to consider is her damage output. Obviously, that's the main job of a main DPS. And there's a reason that, well, they're called a DPS. It's damage per second. And Carlotta has a lot of it. I would say that at a casual level, Carlotta might be the second, maybe even the best DPS in the entire game, because her damage output is just that high, and her rotation does not have much room for optimization, so there's no real need to sweat about any animation cancels or whatever. Carlotta is a very simple character to play once you know how her kit works and what her rotation is. Obviously, she's a bit harder to understand if you're just trying to read her kit, but once you do understand, it's just like clockwork. You might as well just call it a loop. Carlotta has managed to hit some of the highest numbers in the entire game, and has been able to get some of the fastest clear times on my entire account. Now keep in mind, I have a very good account. I have a lot of characters and their signature weapon, and I even have Shang Liao's S1. So being able to compete with that is incredibly impressive for Carlotta, especially since her talents are not even on the same level yet. Typically, I get everyone's talents to 8, with their main damaging talent to 10. But because the weekly boss, I have been unable to do this with Carlotta, so her damage will only get better from here. I haven't even fully optimized her echoes, and she's already brilliantly strong. So Carlotta's damage output is already incredibly impressive. But one thing I have noticed with Carlotta is that AoE scenarios are not her favorite, because most of her abilities will target one enemy and will just send a straight line of damage. It's not like Jinchi where you have a larger area of damage. It's literally just a line. And sure, this line may have a little bit of girth. It's not that much, so most of the time you'll only be hitting 1 or maybe 2 enemies. So if you're trying to play her in AoE content, you're probably not going to be having as much of a fun time as when you're fighting bosses. But when you are fighting bosses, you're gaming. And considering the fact that most of Tower of Adversity is bosses, you're probably going to be gaming. Another thing that I have found brilliant about Carlotta is the fact that she actually, well, she's a ranged character. And it's not like Jinchi where you don't have to sit directly next to the enemy. No, it's like actual range. You can be quite nearly anywhere on the map and her abilities will hit the enemy. And this is very convenient, especially because gun characters will have auto-aim on bosses, and this will help you a lot against very mobile enemies like the Mephises. Tempest and Thundering Mephis have to be some of my least favorite bosses in the entire game, featuring animations at the start of the battle that have them be invincible, and then followed by the fact that they move around like schizophrenic children, which is quite annoying. But Carlotta, because she's able to auto-aim on them, doesn't really care. In fact, she feels like the ultimate counter towards these enemies, which is incredibly appreciated by someone who absolutely despises them. It gets even better when you realize that the Mephises have a lot of attacks you can parry, and Carlotta is our first gun character who can consistently parry enemy attacks. Especially within her ultimate, she is able to parry enemies, and that is incredibly fun to see, because parries are just a really satisfying mechanic to utilize. So seeing a gun character being able to do it is something that I quite appreciate. Now, I do want to talk about one thing, which is while the fact that Carlotta's kit heavily de-incentivizes quick-swapping teams, they do still work. It's not going to be as good as using a hyper-carry support like Sanhua or Yang Yang or obviously Zheji, but it will be usable if you want to use Changli and Carlotta together, for example. It's definitely not an optimal team, because during Carlotta's ultimate you should not be switching out, which means that Changli does not get to build any enflammement stacks and she's just kind of sitting there. But paradoxically, this does lead to Changli being able to wait for her cooldowns, which is something that if you were to just simply spam the buttons, you would have some cooldown issues. So paradoxically, it's not that big of a deal, even if it is overall a DPS loss. But it mainly feels good because Carlotta's general strength is kind of off the rocker. Carlotta is an insanely strong carry, and just putting her into a quickswap team makes it so her incredibly strong damage gets taken advantage of in a different type of scenario. Now, I think this is a good time where we start talking about Jeju and how reliant Carlotta actually is on her. And I will say that Carlotta has proven herself to have good performance without Jeju. She has plenty of alternatives of characters that you can run instead of Jeju, which is very nice to see, because one of my main fears was the fact that she would end up just feeling kind of bad if she didn't have Jeju. But thankfully, that didn't really end up being an issue. Obviously, it's still going to be worse, but it's not by as much as I thought it would be, because characters like Yang Yang and Sanhua are good for their short rotation time, which means you get easy Moonlit Clouds and buffs from their S6, but then you also have Lumi and Tao Chi. Now, I will say that I do not generally recommend these characters to most people, because in order to make them effective, you have to do a lot of swapping that most people do not want to engage with, especially mobile players. So I still do not feel good about recommending Lumi or Tao Chi with your Carlotta. But if you really want to see nukes and you don't have a Jeju, it is your best alternative. And I think it is quite important to mention that. Overall, this doesn't mean that Lumi and Tao Chi are good characters with Carlotta, it's just that Carlotta is so strong that their weaknesses end up not really being as relevant as they would be otherwise. But obviously, it's still not all sunshine and rainbows, because outside of the fact that her AoE isn't that great, I do have one other complaint about Carlotta, which is the fact that during her ult stance, being interrupted is kind of like her kryptonite, and that is very annoying, especially in hologram fights. While I was running the Fallacy of No Return 6, I found myself having to waste a lot of damage in her ult state, which also wastes a lot of energy, because I had to dodge while I was in the middle of my attack. And because her gunshots only come out at the end of the animation, this is not that hard to see happen. And that is incredibly unfortunate, because her death knells actually do a lot of damage while also generating 5 energy. And 5 energy is actually quite a lot when you're playing a character like Carlotta, because her ultimate cost is 125. Now, it doesn't actually seem like that much, but trust me, you'll feel the difference, especially depending on your build. I think for scenarios like that, I do want to hunt for an extra energy roll. But that's just my thoughts on Carlotta. She definitely seems to be an incredibly strong carry, and I would love to see where she goes once we are actually able to level up all of her talents. She clearly lived up to the hype for a lot of people, including me. But what are your thoughts on Carlotta? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. If you want to get into a discussion with me or have any questions, be sure to join my Discord, which is linked in the description. Or if you just want to see my random thoughts on things, be sure to follow me on Twitter, which is also linked in the description. But that'll be it from me. Peace.